my grandfather moved here from Mapleton, North Dakota in 1906 with his half-brother Joe and a couple of friends, and they homesteaded that year. So it was, I think they got here, you know, later on in the spring or early summer, and applied through the Homestead Act to buy a quarter of land each, which they did, and then signed the papers that were necessary and began the process of breaking up a little land each, because each of them had a quarter of land and they needed to break so many acres a year in order to prove it up so that they could keep it after 2 or 3 years' time. Then Grandpa married a teacher that moved here from Prescott, Ontario, and she moved to the little school called Bank School, which was a half a mile away from here, and they fell in love, obviously. And even though they were very different people, my grandmother was a very strong Methodist, and my grandpa was a drinker and a dancer and a partier, but they seemed to do very well for over 50 years. And then they had 4 kids. One of whom was my father, Vern, who then took over the farm after he got back from the Second World War, where he was a navigator, flying Lancasters. And in 1946 he married my mom Nettie, who is the daughter of a couple in Gull Lake, and also the daughter of she was the daughter of another homesteader in this area from just south of here. And then Shannon and I moved here in 1978 to take over the farm. The 4 of them lived in this shack all winter long. Part of proving up meant that you had to break a certain amount of land each year, but it also meant that you had to stay over. First, the first picture of our farm when we moved here in 1978, a week before we got married, we came down and planted 6,000 trees on this quarter that was adjacent to the original homestead. The original homestead was on this quarter, and we built right adjacent to it. And then this is the old homestead shack right there. It sat beside this little old red trailer, and that's where our family spent our time in the summers. The house that Grandpa had built in this area had sort of fallen apart by that time, and we lived in Gull Lake. We had a family of 5, and so we lived in there. My dad drove back and forth farming. And then when we moved here in '78, we bought this quarter, planted the trees, and then began building the farmyard where we are now, right there. So neither one of us like wind, and in this country it's really windy. That's why we planted all the trees when we first came here. And so now we actually have a forest to live in days like this and in the winter. From the time I was a little boy, I knew that I wanted to farm, and so there were 5 kids in our family, 2 of whom were brothers, and in that day and age, girls really didn't have the opportunity. It wasn't fair, but they didn't really have the opportunity. And if the boys wanted to farm, most of it just got to. And I was the middle of the 3 boys, and so we grew up all believing that we had to go to school after we finished high school. That was just part of how we were brought up, and so I went off to school for a few years. And partly I was waiting for my brothers to decide whether or not they wanted to farm, because it was obvious the farm was only big enough for probably one of us. And once it became apparent that neither of them wanted to farm, then by that time I had fallen in love with Shannon, and she had agreed that farming might be not a bad way to spend the rest of her life, as she was a farmer too, or grew up on a farm, and so we moved back here in '78. So this, when we came home, we bought this quarter that lines up with this row of trees here. So my grandpa's quarter, his home quarter, was the one adjacent here. So at this row of trees here, that quarter, the northwest, was his homestead quarter, and then this belonged to a man named Mr. Banks, and he bought it from him later. So then we bought this quarter from my dad when we came home, and then Uncle Joe owned the quarter that's adjacent to it over there. So this is the original old farmyard, starting right here. Okay. And then my dad built all of these granaries. When he came home, he took the School of Agriculture, came home, and then he started building all the wooden bins. And then as we've added on all the steel bins as time has gone along, we've kept all these for storage. So it's kind of a, I like it like that. I'm not sure if everybody would, but I like the idea that the old and new are still there. Came home there, Dad didn't have cows. He only did in the late 40s. And then he got out of cows when he moved into town. So when we came home, Shannon and I built all of these corrals here. and we ended up having 135 cows and calves. We had them for 25 years, and then that was our first step toward retirement in 1955 when we sold them. It was a barn, always. Now it's a machinery storage shed, but it was a barn that my Uncle Joe built and put it on a stone foundation over there. Then my grandpa moved it over here, and then my dad moved it one step, I think it sat over that way, and then my dad moved it there, and then we moved it there.
So it just gradually...
Yeah, each generation
moved a little farther over.
it just got moved a little bit more. Yeah. And then this bin here was a bin that my dad built in 1954, I think it was. Okay. And interestingly, in the 50s, he used to talk about the 50s much like we talk about these last 6 or 7 years. It was wet all the time. There was big crops in those years. Often it got frozen because it got so late, and the crops were still susceptible at that time to rust, so they lost many of their crops. But so when Dad turned 90, on the same year that Tessa got married, then we had a big celebration for him, and we renovated this bin in his honor, and then put this little plaque on there. I don't know if you can get it. This is on the occasion of his 90th birthday. This restored granary is dedicated to Vern Small and his recently passed bride of 63 years, Nettie. Having used the latest in bin construction techniques of the 1954 era, their building has stood the test of time. It now remains in recognition of the contribution they made to our family farm and the development of grain farming in southwest Saskatchewan. I do like the prairie. I like to be able to see when I know people from many different places, and a lot of people think that it's boring driving across Saskatchewan or across the prairies because there's nothing to see, and I guess I've always felt that driving across the prairies I could see everything. Whereas when I'm in the mountains and driving through the forest, I feel like I can't see anything. The trees are in the way. As much as I love trees to block the wind, when I'm traveling, to me they seem to be in the way.
I really got tired of living in the city, and I really wanted to be in the country, so I was very happy to move out here. It was different, I had said before, because there was no trees here at all, which was very different for me because I grew up in an area where when I spent the summers on the farm, there was a lot of bush, and so very different kind of that way. But I did grow to love the prairie, I think, the longer I was here, and then it did help for us to develop our own little oasis out here, for sure. Very friendly people in Gull Lake. I really enjoyed the town of Gull Lake, and when we moved here, the summer we moved here, I was hired as the director of care at the special care home in Gull Lake, which was really a bonus for me as a psychiatric nurse, and so things just all kind of fell into place here for us. And, yeah.
They each had to pay $10 to buy that first quarter of land. And then if in the first, I think it was 3 years, if they proved it up, then they could buy the adjacent quarter. So for Uncle Joe and Grandpa, that meant the quarter that went from the road that you can see, the north-south road, to another quarter-mile past that row of trees. So they both did prove up in those 3 years. I think they had to have so many acres broken each year and own so many animals. And then for another $10, they got the other quarter. So then between the two of them, they owned 4 by the end of their 3rd year. When my grandpa started farming in 1906, he had 2 teams of horses. Well, not right away, but he ended up with 2 teams of horses. I think there was 6 in each team, and they pulled a plow that was 4 feet wide. And now on our little farm here, we have one of the smaller drills, and it's 40 feet wide. So just to, it's 10 times things, and not only that, we go 3 times as fast, and we have things 10 times as wide. So just for someone that isn't sort of in touch with what's been happening with farming over the last 100 years, that gives a pretty good picture of what it's been like. As we were talking about earlier when we were on our little walk, we were talking about how it was such hard work in those days, and my grandpa's comment to me that, well, maybe it was hard work, but at the end, when the horses got tired, then we got to quit. Whereas with the advent of tractors and and bigger equipment and more comfortable equipment, and which has become, as time has gone on, the equipment is comfortable, but if the tractor doesn't get tired, it may break down, but it doesn't get tired, and so it can go as long as you possibly can. And we tend to have stress of a different nature, I think, in farming today than what my grandpa did. It was mainly physical stress and physical fatigue that you felt, where for many farmers, not us so much anymore because we're farming in a smaller kind of way, but certainly for the young people that are driving equipment that goes 20 miles an hour in the field and they're doing that for 14 and 16 and 18 hours a day, there's that's hard work too. So, and very stressful. So
like when we first came home, we bought land at very high interest rates, so we needed to work off the farm. So it was hard work because we both had jobs as off the farm. We had 3 kids that were involved in a lot of activities, and then we got cows as well as the grain farming, and our days were long, and yeah, it was different for sure than what Steve's grandfather did, and his dad, because they didn't work off the farm. So
this part of our farm we have seeded to grass because when we got home in 1978, the first thing my dad said to us was, I did what I thought was the right thing as a farmer, but I've created some problems on the farm. Because what he had done, when he had gone to the School of Agriculture, they told him that to grow crops and to preserve your land, what you needed to do is summer fallow, to kill weeds and to control them, and also to conserve moisture. So he was really good at that, like most of the farmers in that day and age were. And he would have his soil every other year, it would be black. And then unknown to them at that time, what they were doing was creating salt deposits all around any body of water like that. So this big body of water would fill up like it has right now in the spring. Then the year that they summer followed right next to it, the water would leach the salts down from the slough, and then water of course goes any direction it needs to, so then as it dried up on the outskirts, it moved with the salt over there, and then all the salts came up around it. So all this area that you see that's planted to grass on the outside of that big slough was turning into salty land that wouldn't grow much of anything. So what we did was we started seeding it all down to grass with deep roots to use up that moisture. When we moved home here, we had no frogs, and then we rented a pasture down at the coulee where there's a creek going through it down there, and our older son Cody used to come down to check the cows with me all the time. And one day when he was down there, he found a frog, and then he found a whole bunch of frogs, and he said, can I take them home? And so every day we went down there, he'd take an ice cream pail and he'd put 20 or 25 of these frogs in, and so what he did, now in the spring, at night you can't hear yourself think.